By September 1944, the Allied High Command was intoxicated by the scent of an imminent victory. The collapse of the German 7th Army at the Falaise pocket had turned the liberation of France into a frantic race toward the Rhine. In the halls of SHAEF, the maps were being redrawn with a speed that bordered on the reckless. It was a moment of profound historical irony where the very success of the Normandy invasion birthed a dangerous, systemic overconfidence. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man defined by his methodical caution, suddenly pivoted toward the most audacious gamble of his career. Operation Market Garden was not merely a plan, it was a manifestation of institutional hubris. The objective was a lightning strike through the Netherlands, seizing a series of bridges to outflank the Siegfried Line and open a direct corridor into the industrial heart of Germany. It was a masterstroke on paper that ignored every fundamental reality of the terrain and the enemy's resilience. The systemic failures began long before the first paratrooper hooked his static line. Allied intelligence had become a victim of its own narrative, filtering out any data that contradicted the image of a broken Wehrmacht. When low-level reconnaissance flights returned with photographs of heavy German armor concealed in the woods near Arnhem, the reports were buried. Major Brian Urquhart, the intelligence officer who dared to sound the alarm, was dismissed as being stressed and ordered to take medical leave. The machinery of war had already decided its path, and it would not allow the truth to stall its momentum. The plan relied on a fragile, single-threaded logic. The market element, consisting of 3 airborne divisions, would drop into the Dutch countryside to seize the bridges. Simultaneously, the Garden element, the British XXX Corps, would roar up a single, narrow highway to link them all together. It was a tactical nightmare. A single stalled vehicle on that narrow ribbon of asphalt could, and would, paralyze an entire army. The Allies were betting the fate of the war on a logistical miracle that required perfect weather, perfect timing, and a passive enemy. On the morning of September 17th, the sky over the Netherlands was filled with the roar of thousands of engines. To the civilians below, it looked like the end of the war. They poured into the streets with orange flowers, cheering the paratroopers as they drifted down into the fields. But the festive atmosphere was a cruel illusion. Beneath the canopy of the Dutch forests, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions were refitting. They were not the shattered remnants the Allies expected, but a coiled spring ready to snap. The tactical disasters began within hours of the drop. The British 1st Airborne Division, tasked with the furthest and most critical objective at Arnhem, was dropped nearly 8 miles from the bridge they were meant to seize. The decision to prioritize safe landing zones over tactical proximity was the first domino to fall. As the Red Devils began their long march toward the town, the element of surprise evaporated. They were no longer the hunters, they were walking into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. Communication, the lifeblood of any complex operation, failed immediately. The British radios, tuned for the flat plains of England, were useless among the brick houses and iron-heavy soil of the Dutch suburbs. Commanders were flying blind, unable to coordinate their battalions or call for the vital air support that might have leveled the playing field. In the silence of the radio waves, the 1st Airborne became a collection of isolated islands, fighting separate, desperate battles against an enemy that was rapidly consolidating. At the Arnhem Bridge itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and a few hundred men managed to seize the northern end. They were the unsung heart of the operation, holding a position that was never meant to be defended for more than 48 hours. They found themselves surrounded by the elite of the SS, facing Tiger tanks with nothing but light infantry weapons and a stubborn, defiant courage. For 3 days and nights, the bridge became a furnace of urban combat, where the rubble of the city served as the only protection against a relentless barrage of high explosives. While Frost held the bridge, the rest of the division was being compressed into a tiny, blood-soaked perimeter at Oosterbeek. Here, the tragedy took on a hauntingly personal scale. The Dutch civilians, who had greeted the soldiers with joy just days before, now found their homes turned into dressing stations and their gardens into graveyards. Doctors worked by candlelight in basements, performing amputations while the walls shook from German 88mm shells. The liberation they had prayed for had become a siege of unimaginable brutality. To the south, the armored thrust of XXX Corps was suffocating. The road to Arnhem, soon to be known as Hell's Highway, was a graveyard of burnt-out Shermans. Every time the column moved, a concealed German anti-tank gun would bark from the tree line, halting the entire procession. The British tankers were fighting for yards in a war that demanded miles. The synergy between the airborne and the armor, the very core of Market Garden, had been severed by the reality of a single road and a determined defense. The arrival of the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade under General Stanislaw Sosabowski was meant to be the final reinforcement. Instead, it became a symbol of the operation's doomed execution. Dropped into a crossfire after days of delay due to weather, the Polish soldiers were slaughtered before they even hit the ground. Sosabowski had warned the British command that the plan was flawed, but like Urquhart before him, his expertise was treated as an inconvenience to the grand design of the generals. By the 9th day, the situation was no longer a battle, it was a massacre. The order was finally given to evacuate the remnants of the 1st Airborne across the Rhine. Under the cover of a dark, rain-swept night, men who had gone into battle as an elite division crawled through the mud to the river's edge. Out of the 10,000 men who had landed at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 made it back. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured, left behind in the ruins of a bridge that was, quite literally, one too far. The aftermath of Market Garden was a bitter harvest. The operation had failed in its primary objective, leaving the Allies with a narrow, useless salient and a shattered airborne corps. The Dutch people paid the highest price. The failed liberation triggered a retaliatory famine known as the Hunger Winter, where thousands perished while the front lines remained frozen. The war would not end by Christmas. It would drag on through the frozen forests of the Ardennes and the industrial meat grinder of the Ruhr. Historically, Market Garden stands as a grim monument to the limits of military genius. It was a failure of the system, where the chain of command became a closed loop of self-reinforcement, deaf to the warnings of the ground and the reality of the enemy. It proved that in the theater of war, no amount of individual bravery can compensate for a strategic architecture built on the shifting sands of ego and assumption. As the mists of time settle over the polders of the Netherlands, the silent crosses at Oosterbeek remain. They are the final witnesses to a week in September when the world held its breath and watched a dream of peace dissolve into a nightmare of fire and steel. The tragedy of Arnhem is not just in the loss of life, but in the crushing weight of what might have been, had the men at the top been as humble as the men in the foxholes. The bridges have long since been rebuilt, and the scars on the brickwork of Arnhem have been patched. But the ghosts of the Red Devils still linger in the rustle of the Dutch poplars. They remind us that history is not moved by grand designs alone, but by the friction of human error and the heavy cost of the shortcuts we take toward victory. In the end, the road to Berlin was not found in a daring leap, but in the long, agonizing crawl of a winter that need not have been so cold. The echoes of the guns have faded, leaving only the quiet dignity of the veterans and the solemn gratitude of a nation that remembers the price of its freedom. Market Garden remains the ultimate lesson in the fragility of momentum. It is a story of how the highest aspirations of man can be undone by the simplest of oversights, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and the haunting silence of a bridge that led to nowhere. Beyond the tactical maps and the post-war memoirs, the true narrative of Arnhem is found in the eyes of the men who stood their ground when the world had already moved on. It is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of systemic collapse. Though the operation failed, the courage of those who fought in the shadows of the Arnhem Bridge remains a beacon of selfless sacrifice, a light that even the darkest failures of command cannot extinguish. Now, as the sun sets over the Rhine, we are left to ponder the heavy ironies of that fateful autumn. We see a generation that gave everything for a plan that gave them nothing in return. We see the brilliance of the few overshadowed by the blindness of the many. And we see, in the quiet flow of the river, the timeless truth that in war, the greatest distance is often the shortest path we try to take. The story of Market Garden is a tragedy in 5 acts, a drama of hubris, silence, fire, sacrifice, and the long, cold wait for a spring that was delayed by the hubris of the fall. It is a chapter of history that refuses to be forgotten, a permanent reminder that the cost of a mistake is always paid by those who have the least say in making it. And so, the bridge at Arnhem stands not as a victory, but as a sentinel, watching over the fields where 1,000 dreams of a quick peace were buried in the Dutch mud. In the final accounting, the operation was a masterpiece of failure, a symphony of errors played out on a grand scale. But within that failure, we find the purest form of heroism, the kind that does not ask for success as a condition for its existence. The men of the 1st Airborne, the Polish paratroopers, and the Dutch resistance fighters did not fail, they were failed by the very structures meant to lead them. Their story is the soul of history, a narrative of light within the dark, and a legacy that will endure as long as the Rhine flows toward the sea.